Have you ever seen a political rookie seize control of a national TV studio with nothing more than a case file and a single photograph? That night, under the lights of Real Time with Bill Maher, the air was taut, not because of the brightness, but because of the standoff between a veteran host and a fast-rising congresswoman. Jasmine Crockett sat upright in a navy suit. Across from her, Bill Maher flashed his trademark half-smile and launched in, "Congresswoman, you're pushing voting rights legislation, but does voter suppression actually exist? Or is it just a hyped-up story to fire up Democrats?" the audience murmured, every eye fixed on the guest, waiting for a misstep. Crockett didn't flinch. Her voice landed like a gavel. Before Congress, she was an attorney. She had stood alongside Americans who waited 7 hours to vote. "While you were in the studio," she said, "I was in court with elderly voters who'd been purged from the rolls. This isn't a myth." She opened a folder. "I have federal court rulings from 3 circuits. Would you like to see the evidence that persuaded the judges' silence?" Then applause. Tentative at first, then swelling. The room's energy shifted. On Bill Maher's face, confidence gave way to a flicker of unease. The audience, his audience, was leaning toward the evidence. In that moment, this stopped being a 2-person interview. It became a live lesson in the power of preparation and on-the-ground experience. When facts are on the table, television's home field advantage is no shield. If you want more stories like this, where knowledge and composure stand up to raw power, hit subscribe and join our community at the Jasmine Crockett File. We bring you political moments that don't just shock, but inspire. Representative Jasmine Crockett had not taken a traditional path to Congress. Before winning her seat in 2022, she had established herself as a formidable civil rights attorney in Texas. Personally, handling over 100 voting rights cases and building a reputation for methodical preparation and unshakable courtroom presence. Her work had directly challenged restrictive voting laws and registration purges that disproportionately affected minority communities and elderly voters. Growing up in Street Louis, in a family that emphasized education and civic responsibility, Crockett had developed a deep understanding of both the legal framework and lived reality of voting rights challenges. Her father, a history teacher who had participated in civil rights marches in the 1962s, had instilled in her a reverence for the vote as sacred ground worth defending. After graduating from Rhodes College and the University of Houston Law Center, she had dedicated her career to that defense. First in courtrooms and later in the Texas legislature, where she served 1 term before her election to Congress. As a freshman representative, Crockett had quickly established herself as a substantive voice rather than a performative one. Her colleagues noted her reluctance to engage in the cable news circuit without thorough preparation, and her preference for detailed policy discussions over partisan sound bites. She treats congressional hearings like court appearances. One senior committee member had remarked, always overprepared and focused on evidence rather than emotion. Bill Maher, by contrast, represented a different approach to political discourse. As the host of Real Time since 2003, he had built his brand on provocative statements and a willingness to challenge progressive orthodoxy despite his generally liberal leanings. His confrontational interview style often relied on catching guests off guard with contrarian positions, creating moments of tension that entertained his audience while reinforcing his image as an independent thinker, unbound by partisan expectations. At 68, Maher had spent decades cultivating relationships with political figures across the spectrum, many of whom appeared on his show despite knowing they might face difficult questions. His approach typically succeeded because politicians valued his platform and audience reach, often accepting uncomfortable moments as the price of access to his influential viewership. The stage for their confrontation had been set when Crockett's office received an invitation to appear on Real Time following her introduction of the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2025 legislation designed to restore and strengthen key provisions of the original Voting Rights Act. The bill had gained significant attention not only for its substance, but for Crockett's effectiveness in articulating its importance through concrete examples rather than abstract principles. While her staff had initially hesitated, Maher likes to make progressives look foolish. Her communications director warned Crockett had recognized the opportunity to reach a different audience than her usual supporters. "We're not going to change minds by only talking to people who already agree with us," she had responded. "But we're also not going into this unprepared." In the week before her appearance, Crockett had immersed herself in preparation. She reviewed Maher's previous segments on voting rights, noting his tendency to dismiss concerns about voter suppression as exaggerated. She compiled a binder of specific cases her office had handled, complete with photographic evidence, court findings, and personal testimonials from affected voters. Most importantly, she prepared concise, factual responses to the arguments she anticipated Maher would make. He's going to try to make this abstract, philosophical, and partisan. She told her team during a preparation session, "Our job is to make it concrete, factual, and human. He'll have opinions. We'll have evidence." What Maher didn't realize as the broadcast began was that Crockett had spent years developing exactly the skills needed to counter his interview approach. As a trial attorney, she had faced hostile judges and opposing counsel who attempted similar tactics of dismissal and derision. She had learned that emotional reactions only weakened her position, while methodical presentation of evidence could turn even the most skeptical arbiters in her favor. As she walked onto the set that evening, Crockett carried not just her preparation materials, but the confidence of someone who had prevailed in far more consequential arenas than a television studio. While Maher saw an opportunity for an entertaining segment that would reinforce his contrarian brand, Crockett recognized something different, a chance to demonstrate that substantive advocacy could prevail over performative provocation. Even on the provocateur's home turf, the HBO studio hummed with pre-bro energy as the production team completed final preparations for that evening's episode of Real Time. The blue and red set, designed to evoke political discourse while maintaining a casual atmosphere, stood in contrast to the intensely focused preparation occurring backstage. In his dressing room, Bill Maher reviewed note cards with his segment producer, occasionally chuckling at particularly pointed questions they had prepared. "The voter ID thing always gets them," he noted. "They never have a good answer for why identification is required for everything else in American life, but supposedly suppresses votes." Meanwhile, in the guest preparation area, Representative Crockett arranged her materials, placing specific documents where she could access them quickly if needed. Her legislative director watched with quiet admiration as she meticulously tabbed pages in her binder with color-coded markers. Blue for statistical evidence, yellow for case summaries, red for direct testimonials from affected voters. "Remember," her director advised, "he'll try to talk over you if you start gaining traction. Don't get pulled into his rhythm." Crockett nodded. "In court, we call that controlling the witness. The remedy is the same pause, redirect, and present evidence rather than opinion." As the broadcast began, Maher moved through his opening monologue and panel discussion before introducing Crockett as his featured guest for the evening's one-on-one interview segment. The audience applauded politely as she walked onto the set, exchanging a professional handshake with Maher before taking her seat. "Congresswoman Crockett, welcome to Real Time." Maher began with his characteristic half-smile. You've become something of a rising star in progressive circles with your voting rights legislation. It's quite an achievement for someone relatively new to Congress. Thank you for having me. Bill, Crockett responded, her tone collegial but focused. The legislation addresses real barriers that prevent eligible citizens from exercising their constitutional right to vote. Maher nodded, then shifted to his planned approach. Here's what I don't understand, he said, leaning forward. We keep hearing about voter suppression, but turnout has been at record highs in recent elections. In 2020, we had the highest voter participation in over a century. Doesn't that fundamentally contradict the narrative that voting is becoming harder? The question was classic Maher, seemingly reasonable while designed to undermine his guest's core position. Many politicians would have immediately become defensive, but Crockett responded with the calm precision that had served her in courtrooms. That's an important point to address. She acknowledged high turnout and voter suppression can coexist. In fact, they often do. When communities face obstacles to voting, many people work harder to overcome them, which can mask the underlying problem. It's like saying traffic barriers don't exist because people still manage to get to work by leaving hours earlier and finding alternative routes. She reached for her binder. I have the data here, showing that in districts with new voting restrictions, the average voter spent 82 minutes longer in line than in comparable districts without those restrictions. People voted despite the barriers, not because they were absent. Ma, slightly thrown by her prepared response, pivoted to his next point. But let's talk about specific policies that get labeled as suppression, like requiring ID to vote. Most Americans, including a majority of Democrats, according to some polls, support voter ID requirements. Are you suggesting all these people favor suppression? The issue isn't identification itself, Crockett countered. It's which forms of ID are accepted and how difficult they are to obtain. She opened her binder to a marked page. In one Texas county I represented, a gun license was acceptable ID for voting, but a student ID from a state university was not. When we deposed the officials who created this policy, they couldn't provide any security-based rationale for that distinction. Maher attempted to interrupt, but Crockett continued with methodical focus. Furthermore, in counties where DMV offices were closed or had limited hours, obtaining an acceptable ID required taking unpaid time off work and traveling significant distances for hourly workers or those without personal transportation that created a substantial barrier. The audience, which had initially seemed aligned with Maher's skepticism, began showing signs of engagement with Crockett's evidence-based approach. Their attention visibly shifted toward her documentation, creating a dynamic Maher rarely encountered on his own show. Recognizing this shift, he employed a tactic that often succeeded with less prepared guests' humor as dismissal. "Come on, Congresswoman," he said with an exaggerated eye roll. "Are we really saying people can figure out how to get a smartphone, set up social media accounts, and navigate complex benefit systems? But somehow, getting an ID is this insurmountable obstacle. At some point, doesn't personal responsibility enter the equation?" The studio audience offered scattered laughter and some applause, momentarily restoring Maher's home field advantage. Many politicians would have become flustered or defensive at this point, falling into the trap of appearing overly sensitive. Crockett, however, nodded thoughtfully before responding. Personal responsibility matters in every context. Bill, but let me introduce you to someone. She removed a photograph from her binder, holding it toward both Maher and the camera. It showed an elderly African-American woman with a dignified expression. This is Mrs. Eleanor Hawkins, 82 years old, born in rural Mississippi, where birth certificates weren't consistently issued to African Americans in the 1940 seconds. She voted in every election for 6 decades, until new ID requirements in her state rejected her expired driver's license. She no longer drives, lives on a fixed income, and would need to spend $40 on transportation to reach the nearest government office that could help her. An office open only during weekday business hours. Crockett looked directly at Maher. She tried 3 times to get the necessary documentation. Each time she was told something different about what she needed to provide. Is that about personal responsibility? Or is it about systems designed to make voting disproportionately difficult for specific communities? The studio had fallen completely silent. The production team, accustomed to managing audience reactions, exchanged glances as they recognized something unusual was happening. Maher's audience was being persuaded against his position in real time. Maher, sensing the shift, attempted to reclaim control. One compelling anecdote doesn't prove systematic suppression. He argued for every story like Mrs. Hawkins. There are thousands of people who manage to get IDs without issue. You're absolutely right that individual cases don't prove systems. Crockett agreed, surprising Maher with her concession before continuing. That's why we need to look at the data. She presented another document from her binder. This analysis from the Brennan Center examined 250 counties before and after strict ID laws were implemented. The study controlled for demographics, economic factors, and political competitiveness. The finding was clear. After these laws passed, turnout decreased by an average of 3. 7 percentage points among minority voters compared to statistically similar counties without such restrictions. She turned a page in her binder. And when we look at which communities face polling place closures, reduced early voting, and purged voter rolls, the pattern becomes even clearer. In the 5 states I've represented cases in, these measures disproportionately affected minority communities by a factor of 3 to 1. Maher, visibly frustrated by Crockett's command of both anecdotal and statistical evidence, tempted a more direct challenge. Congresswoman, with respect, don't Democrats benefit politically from making these claims about suppression? It rallies your base, brings in donations, and provides an excuse for any potential losses. Isn't there a vested interest in exaggerating these concerns? The question was designed to force Crockett into a defensive posture about partisan motivations. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. Political incentives always exist on all sides of any issue, she acknowledged. That's precisely why I'm not asking anyone to simply take my word for it. She removed several more documents from her binder. These are court decisions, many written by Republican-appointed judges, that found specific voting restrictions violated constitutional rights. They didn't rule based on partisan talking points, but on evidence presented under oath and subject to cross-examination. She handed copies to Ma. In the past 5 years alone, federal courts have struck down voting restrictions in Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona, after finding that the burden on voters couldn't be justified by any legitimate state interest. These aren't partisan claims. They're legal findings established through the adversarial process our judicial system relies on. Maher glanced at the documents momentarily, at a loss for his usual quick retort. The audience, sensing his hesitation, began applauding Crockett's thorough presentation, a rare moment when a real-time guest had visibly gained the upper hand through preparation rather than performance. Recognizing the need to regain control of his show, Maher tried one final approach. "Let me ask you directly," he said, his tone becoming more serious. "If your bill passed tomorrow and every provision you're advocating was implemented, would you then acknowledge that any future election losses were fair, or would there always be some new form of suppression to claim?" It was a classic false dichotomy designed to paint Crockett into a corner, but she recognized the tactic immediately. Elections should be evaluated on their specific circumstances, not through blanket declarations, she replied. What I can tell you is that when every eligible voter can register easily, when waiting times are reasonably similar across communities, when working people have sufficient opportunities to cast their ballots, and when valid votes are correctly counted, then we'll have elections that truly reflect the will of the people, regardless of which candidates or parties win. She closed her binder, making direct eye contact with Maher. This isn't about ensuring specific outcomes, Bill. It's about upholding the fundamental principle that in a democracy, the right to vote should not depend on your zip code, work schedule, physical ability, or economic resources. That's not a progressive position or a conservative position. It's an American position rooted in constitutional values. The studio audience burst into spontaneous applause, not the polite acknowledgement typically offered to guests, but the enthusiastic response usually reserved for Maher's own most pointed commentaries. The host, recognizing he had lost this particular exchange, nodded with reluctant respect before glancing at his producers for the signal to break for commercial. "We'll be right back with more from Congresswoman Crockett after this," he said, his tone suggesting he recognized that the second half of the interview would require a different approach than he had initially planned. As the cameras cut away, the production team exchanged glances, recognizing they had just witnessed something rare. A guest who had shifted the audience's allegiance through substance rather than style, and who had done so on the host's own carefully controlled platform. When the commercial break ended, attentive viewers noticed a subtle but significant shift in the dynamic between host and guest. Bill Maher, a television veteran skilled at controlling his program's trajectory, had visibly recalibrated his approach. His posture was slightly less forward-leaning, his expression more thoughtful than combative as the cameras returned to the set. "Welcome back to my conversation with Representative Jasmine Crockett." He began, his tone noticeably more measured. "Congresswoman, before the break, you made some compelling points about specific barriers to voting. I want to shift gears slightly and ask about solutions. Your legislation proposes several remedies, but critics suggest they might open the door to potential fraud. How do you respond to concerns about election security?" The question remained challenging but lacked the dismissive edge of his earlier approach, a tacit acknowledgement that Crockett had earned a more substantive exchange. Election security and voter access aren't opposing goals. They're complementary, Crockett responded, maintaining her evidence-based approach. Every provision in our bill maintains or enhances security protocols while removing unnecessary barriers. She opened her binder to another tabbed section. For instance, we propose automatic voter registration through secure government databases like the Social Security Administration, which actually improves accuracy by reducing manual data entry errors. We support paper ballot backups for all electronic systems, risk-limiting audits, and cybersecurity resources for local election offices. Maher nodded, engaging more genuinely with her response than he had earlier, but specifically on the question of voter ID, which we discussed earlier. Do you oppose all identification requirements? Where's the balance between access and verification? Our bill doesn't eliminate identification. It expands the acceptable forms and ensures they're accessible to all eligible voters, Crockett explained. We propose a national standard that includes non-photo options like utility bills and bank statements for voters who sign affidavit, similar to the system used successfully in many states with minimal fraud issues. She presented another document. This report analyzed the 31 credible cases of in-person voter impersonation found nationwide between 2000 and 2024 out of more than 1 billion votes cast. By contrast, restrictive ID laws prevented an estimated 240,000 eligible voters from casting ballots in 2022 alone. The solution should be proportional to the actual problem. This measured, fact-based approach continued to resonate with the studio audience, whose attention remained focused on the substance of the exchange rather than the performative aspects that typically dominated Maher's interviews. When Crockett cited specific provisions of her legislation, several audience members nodded in apparent agreement, a visual cue that didn't escape the host's notice. Recognizing that his typical approach wasn't proving effective, Maher pivoted to a more collaborative tone. "Let me play devil's advocate on one more point," he said, "not because I necessarily disagree with you, but because it's a concern many Americans have. Doesn't standardizing election procedures nationally undermine the traditional state control of elections that's been part of our system since the founding?" The framing was notably more respectful, presenting the question as a legitimate concern rather than a partisan talking point. And Crockett responded in kind. "That's a thoughtful question that gets to our constitutional structure." She acknowledged the Constitution gives states primary authority over elections, but it also specifically empowers Congress to override state regulations for federal elections. The framers built in this federal oversight precisely because they recognized that states might create unfair election systems. She turned to another tab page. James Madison specifically addressed this in Federalist 59, warning that without congressional oversight power, states might create unequal and oppressive voting requirements that would undermine true representation. Our bill respects state administration while establishing baseline standards that ensure equal access for all eligible voters, exactly the balance the Constitution envisions. This historical context visibly impressed several balancing audience members, including some who had initially seemed aligned with Maher's skepticism. The host himself raised his eyebrows slightly, clearly not having anticipated such a specific constitutional reference. "You've clearly done your homework," he conceded, with a hint of the respect he typically reserved for intellectual equals rather than political talking heads. One last question before we wrap up. Given the polarization around election issues, do you see any realistic path to bipartisan support for voting rights legislation? The question offered Crockett an opportunity to pivot toward partisan talking points or to attack Republican positions, as many politicians might have done. Instead, she maintained her evidence-focused approach. "There's more common ground than cable news might suggest," she replied. "When we look at specific provisions rather than partisan packages, we find substantial agreement. For example, 76% of Republican voters support early voting options. 68% support automatic registration when obtaining a driver's license, and 82% support paper ballot backups for all electronic systems. All provisions in our bill." She closed her binder deliberately. "The path forward isn't demonizing those who disagree, but emphasizing the shared values that underlie our democratic system. That every eligible citizen should be able to cast a vote that counts, that our elections should be both secure and accessible, and that the resulting government should truly reflect the will of the people. Those aren't partisan principles. They're American principles." The studio audience responded with the most enthusiastic applause of the segment, a response typically reserved for Maher's own closing arguments rather than those of his guests. The host, recognizing the unusual dynamic that had developed, nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Representative Crockett, we're out of time. But I want to thank you for a substantive conversation," Maher said, his tone suggesting he had gained a new appreciation for his guest during their exchange. "Whatever one's position on the specific legislation, you've clearly thought deeply about these issues." As the segment concluded and the program moved to its closing monologue, the production team, noted something remarkable in their monitoring of social media response. While Maher's interviews typically generated partisan reactions, with viewers either applauding or condemning both host and guest along predictable political lines, the responses to Crockett's appearance cut across typical divisions. Conservative viewers commented that while they might not agree with all her positions, they appreciated her factual approach and respectful tone. Progressive viewers expressed surprise at the substantive nature of the exchange, having anticipated more conflict and less content. The common theme across responses was appreciation for a political discussion that prioritized evidence over emotion and substance over sound bites. In the post-show production meeting, Maher himself acknowledged the unusual nature of the segment. "She came better prepared than almost any politician we've had." He told his executive producer, "Didn't take the bait on anything, might not agree with all her positions, but she knew her stuff." This assessment, coming from a host known for his skepticism toward politicians of all parties, represented perhaps the clearest indication that Crockett's approach had succeeded not merely in advancing her policy positions, but in changing the nature of the conversation itself. As video clips of the exchange began circulating online within hours of the broadcast, political analysts noted that Crockett had accomplished something rare in contemporary media appearances. She had used a challenging interview on unfriendly terrain, not as a platform for performative confrontation, but as an opportunity to present substantive arguments that might actually persuade viewers who didn't already agree with her. In doing so, she had demonstrated that preparation, evidence, and measured delivery could sometimes overcome even the most carefully constructed media environments, and that audiences, when presented with substance rather than spectacle, might still respond to the better argument rather than the louder voice. The repercussions of Crockett's appearance on Real Time extended far beyond the immediate broadcast, influencing both her individual political trajectory and broader conversations about effective political communication in a fractured media landscape. Within hours of the show's airing, clips of the exchange had gone viral across multiple platforms. The most widely shared moment: Crockett presenting Mrs. Hawkins' photograph, while methodically explaining the practical barriers to obtaining identification, garnered over 4 million views by the following morning. The comment sections revealed something unusual in contemporary political discourse. Viewers from across the ideological spectrum acknowledging the effectiveness of her presentation, even when they didn't fully embrace her conclusions. "I still support voter ID laws," wrote one commenter with a conservative-leaning profile, "but I never considered the specific challenges she described. Makes me think we need better solutions for legitimate cases like the woman she mentioned." This cross-ideological impact became the subject of analysis from media observers and political strategists alike. The Columbia Journalism Review published a feature titled "The Crockett Method: How Evidence-Based Advocacy Changed the Conversation" on HBO, examining how her approach had temporarily transformed the typically combative format of political talk shows. What distinguished Representative Crockett's appearance wasn't just her command of facts, but her deliberate refusal to engage in the performative outrage that typically dominates these exchanges. The analysis noted, by maintaining a courtroom-like focus on evidence rather than emotion, she effectively changed the criteria by which viewers evaluated her arguments. For Crockett herself, the aftermath brought both opportunities and strategic considerations. Her office reported a surge in media requests from outlets across the political spectrum, including several that rarely featured progressive politicians. Morning shows, Sunday political programs, and podcast hosts all sought to book the representative who had turned Bill Maher's audience against him with facts rather than fire. Rather than immediately capitalizing on this attention, Crockett and her team made a calculated decision that reflected her substantive approach to public service. She declined most interview requests, selecting only those forums that would allow for detailed policy discussions rather than quick-hit appearances designed to generate viral clips. The congressman's priority is advancing legislation, not becoming a cable news regular. Her communications director explained to disappointed bookers, she'll participate in conversations that allow for substantive exploration of policy details, not those structured around creating conflict for ratings. This selective approach initially puzzled some political consultants who saw her real-time moment as an opportunity to build a national profile quickly. However, it soon revealed its strategic wisdom as Crockett began appearing in forums that amplified her substantive message rather than diluting it through overexposure. Her appearance on Fresh Air with Terry Gross allowed for a 40-minute discussion of voting rights history and current challenges, reaching an audience of thoughtful listeners across political perspectives. A long-form print interview in The Atlantic provided space for detailed explanation of specific provisions in her legislation, complete with historical context and contemporary data. These carefully chosen platforms reinforced her reputation as a serious legislator focused on governance rather than self-promotion. Within Congress, the impact of her media approach translated into unexpected legislative opportunities. 3 weeks after the real-time appearance, a moderate Republican representative from Michigan approached Crockett on the House floor. "I watched your Maher interview," he told her, according to staffers who observed the exchange. "Some of my constituents sent it to me. Actually, I don't agree with everything in your bill, but I think there might be provisions we could work on together, particularly the election security funding and standard early voting periods." This conversation eventually led to a narrower bipartisan bill focused on election infrastructure funding, cybersecurity resources for local election officials, and standardized early voting periods. While more limited than Crockett's original proposal, this legislation attracted support from representatives in both parties who recognized the political benefits of being associated with common-sense improvements to election administration. When this focused bill passed the House 4 months later, with support from 32 Republican representatives, political analysts identified Crockett's evidence-based advocacy as a crucial factor in its success. By framing voting access as a matter of evidence rather than ideology, Representative Crockett created space for cooperation that wouldn't have existed in the typical partisan framework, noted Congressional Quarterly in its analysis of the vote. Her approach allowed lawmakers to evaluate specific provisions on their merits rather than through purely partisan lenses. Beyond her individual legislative achievements, Crockett's real-time appearance spawned what political communication experts began calling evidence-based persuasion, an approach that several candidates and elected officials deliberately adopted in subsequent months. A Democratic gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina explicitly cited Crockett's example when explaining his debate preparation. "We're following the Crockett model. Less time practicing zingers. More time organizing evidence that voters can actually evaluate." His subsequent victory in a traditionally Republican-leaning state suggested the approach had merit beyond the confines of media appearances. Even Bill Maher himself acknowledged the impact of their exchange. In an interview with the New York Times 3 months later, when asked about memorable guests, he mentioned Crockett specifically. "She came in with a level of preparation you rarely see in politicians these days. Didn't try to own me or play to her base. Just methodically presented evidence for her position. I still disagree with some of her conclusions, but I respect how she arrived at them. We could use more of that approach on both sides." For media training consultants who typically advise politicians on message discipline and emotional appeals, Crockett's success prompted a reevaluation of conventional wisdom. Several prominent firms began offering new training modules with names like evidence-based advocacy and persuasion. Through preparation, explicitly referencing the Crockett-Maher exchange as a case study in effective communication. We're seeing a growing recognition that in a fragmented media environment, saturated with emotional appeals, factual precision and methodical presentation can actually help candidates break through, explained Dr. Rebecca Chen, a political communication professor at Stanford University. Representative Crockett demonstrated that audiences across the political spectrum still respond to substantive arguments when they're presented in an accessible, evidence-based manner. Perhaps most significantly, Crockett's approach influenced how some media outlets structured their political segments. Producers at several news programs began requiring guests to submit specific evidence for their claims in advance, shifting away from the rapid-fire, assertion-based exchanges that had dominated political television for decades. The Crockett effect, as one producer termed it, referred to the audience's positive response to factual, evidence-based exchanges rather than performative confrontation. While this shift remained limited to certain programs and formats, it represented a meaningful reconsideration of assumptions about what audiences found engaging in political discourse. For Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath reached beyond media buzz or Bill strategy and into the core of how she understands public service. In a rare reflective interview, a year after the real-time exchange, she tied her method to the first principles of a democracy, a system that assumes citizens can weigh evidence and render reasoned judgments. When politics collapses into tribal performance or emotional manipulation, she noted, we abandon that premise. Her approach, courtroom discipline in a political arena, has since guided not only her media choices, but also constituent work, legislative drafting, and committee practice. Substance first, evidence-centered. As political communication evolved in the years that followed, the Crockett-Maher moment became shorthand among strategists and journalists for how to advocate in polarized environments. Build the case, respect the audience, keep your footing. It offered a counterexample to spectacle. Even in an era addicted to outrage, arguments presented with precision and respect sometimes cross partisan fault lines. Viewers dissatisfied with cable theatrics found in that segment a modest proof of concept. Preparation can outlast provocation. Facts, methodically presented, can move even skeptical listeners. One constituent wrote afterward, I didn't vote for you and probably won't agree with all your positions, but seeing you rely on evidence rather than heat made me proud. You represent our district. In a political culture defined by division, that reaction speaks for itself and suggests a path back to a more functional discourse. Share your take in the comments below. I want to hear what resonates with our audience. If this story connected with you, please like, share, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss what's next. Check out the featured video on screen. It's a piece I'm especially proud of. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you next time. Jasmine Crockett File.